I had planned for a simple hike, nothing too far, nothing too deep into the woods. Just a few hours of walking, fresh air, and maybe some time to clear my head. It was the kind of thing I did every so often when life got too heavy, when work pushed me too hard, or when I just needed to be alone. I checked the forecast before I left. It said there might be light rain later in the evening, but that was nothing to worry about. I had my waterproof jacket, my flashlight, and my small pack with the essentials: water, a knife, some protein bars, and a lighter. Just enough in case I needed it. The trail I picked wasn't a popular one. I liked it that way. It wasn't an official hiking route, just a path that some locals used every now and then. I had walked parts of it before, but never the full loop. It was supposed to circle back to where I parked my truck. A 6-hour round trip, give or take. I started late in the afternoon, maybe around 3. The air was damp, the sky overcast, but it felt good to be out. The first couple of hours went fine. The trees were tall, thick, and packed close together, making everything feel quieter than it actually was. My boots crunched against wet leaves. Birds rustled through the branches, but otherwise, it was peaceful. At some point, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. The path had split in two, and without thinking, I went left. It wasn't an obvious mistake at first. The ground still looked like a trail, narrow, uneven, but still a trail. I kept walking, figuring it would loop back or at least connect to the main path again. But after another hour, the trail was gone. It wasn't a sudden thing. It just sort of faded. The dirt path became scattered leaves. The packed down ground became uneven, with tree roots jutting out at odd angles. I looked around and realized I had no clue where I was. I checked my phone, no service. I wasn't panicking yet. I had my flashlight and I had my bearings, or at least I thought I did. The sun was setting, but I figured if I kept moving in a straight line, I'd find my way back to something familiar. Then the rain started. At first, it was light, just a mist in the air, but soon it became steady. Cold, heavy drops pelted my jacket. The temperature dropped fast, and the wet soaked through my sleeves. The trees dripped, their leaves shaking under the weight of the rain. My boots slipped in the mud. I picked up my pace, moving faster now. I wasn't just lost. I was getting cold, and the last thing I needed was to spend the night out here. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. Just a shape in the distance, hidden between trees. A shadow that looked too square to be natural. I moved closer, my breath heavy, my hands clenched into fists. It was a cabin, old, small, and barely standing. The roof sagged, the wood was gray and split in places, and the windows were dark. No lights, no smoke from a chimney, no sign that anyone had been there for years. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong. But the rain was getting worse, and I needed shelter. I told myself I'd only stay until the storm passed, just long enough to warm up, to get my bearings. The door was unlocked, creaked when I pushed it open. The inside smelled damp, like rotting wood and old earth. My flashlight flickered across the room. Dust, broken furniture, a fireplace filled with ashes long since gone cold. There was a small table, a chair with one leg missing, and a cot pushed against the wall. The mattress was stained, torn open in places, and the blankets were balled up like someone had left in a hurry. I shut the door behind me. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees, making the whole cabin shudder. I moved toward the fireplace, kneeling down to check if anything was left to burn. Nothing, just wet, blackened wood. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. Boot prints, not mine. They were dried into the dirt-covered floor, leading from the door to the cot. Someone had been here. Recently, I stood up fast, scanning the room again. It looked abandoned, but those prints hadn't been there long. The rain slammed against the roof. The wind made the door rattle in its frame. Then, Outside, I heard something move. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps. Slow, careful, close. My flashlight beam jumped across the room as I turned toward the door. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath. Another step, then another. Whoever it was, they were right outside. I backed up, pressing myself into the corner of the room, keeping my flashlight pointed at the door. The handle rattled. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The door didn't open. Whoever was out there, they were waiting. The wind screamed through the trees. The rain slammed against the roof. My fingers tightened around the handle of my flashlight. Then silence. No more footsteps. No more rattling. Just the sound of the storm. I waited. Minutes passed, but I didn't move. My whole body was locked in place. Every muscle tensed, waiting for whatever came next. But nothing happened. Slowly, I crept toward the window. I wiped away the grime with my sleeve and peeked outside. The rain blurred everything, turning the trees into dark, shifting shapes. I couldn't see anyone. I swallowed hard. Whoever had been out there was gone, or hiding. I didn't stay to find out. I grabbed my pack, turned off my flashlight to avoid giving away my position, and eased the door open just an inch. The wind slammed into me, but I ignored it. I listened. Nothing. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the mud. The rain hit my face like ice. I didn't look back. I just ran. Branches scraped my arms. My feet slid on wet leaves. I didn't stop, not until I saw something familiar. The trail. The real one. The one I had lost hours ago. I followed it, moving as fast as I could. My chest burned. My legs ached. But I kept going. When I finally saw my truck, parked exactly where I had left it, I almost collapsed. I didn't even pause to catch my breath. I just yanked the door open, jumped inside, and locked it. I sat there for a long time, listening to the rain hammer against the windshield, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't know who had been out there. I didn't want to know. I just knew that if I had stayed in that cabin any longer, I wouldn't have made it out, and I wasn't going back to find out why. It was a bad idea from the start. I knew it the moment I agreed, but the money was good and I needed it. The job was simple enough, at least on paper. I was supposed to watch over an old cabin on the edge of a graveyard for a few nights. The property belonged to an old man named Victor Holman, a retired gravedigger who'd passed away a few months ago. The land was tied up in legal issues, and until things were sorted, the Holman family needed someone to keep an eye on the place to prevent vandalism or squatters. The cabin wasn't much. One room, a small kitchen, an old wood stove, and a single bed shoved against the far wall. No bathroom, just an outhouse a few yards away. It sat right at the tree line where the woods met the cemetery. Holman had lived there for decades, taking care of the graveyard until he was too old to do the work himself. From what I heard, he barely spoke to anyone, kept to himself, and never let anyone near his place. The first night, it rained hard. I drove up the narrow dirt path leading to the cabin, my truck's headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. The graveyard came into view first, a stretch of old headstones and crooked crosses, some leaning at odd angles, barely visible in the downpour. The Holman cabin sat just beyond, its dark shape barely standing out against the trees behind it. I parked, grabbed my bag, and ran for the door. The rain was cold, soaking through my jacket before I even reached the porch. I fumbled with the key, finally getting the door open, and stepped inside. The air was stale. Dust clung to every surface. A thick smell of old wood, damp earth, and something else, something faint, like rotting leaves, hung in the air. I dropped my bag by the door, took out my flashlight, and shined it around the room. The place was just as small as I'd been told. A wooden table in the center, a few rusted tools hanging from the walls, and the old bed covered in a thin, stained blanket. I locked the door behind me and set up my things. I'd brought a camping stove, some canned food, and a thermos of coffee. The cabin had no electricity, and my phone barely had service, but I had a flashlight, extra batteries, and a lantern. It would be enough. The rain drummed against the roof, a steady rhythm that made the place feel even more isolated. I sat at the table, eating a can of beans straight from the tin, when I heard something outside, a rustling just beyond the window. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The wind? An animal? I stood up slowly, moving toward the window. The glass was streaked with rain, but I could see the graveyard through the trees. I scanned the rows of headstones, looking for movement. Nothing. I waited a little longer, then shook it off. Probably just the wind pushing the branches against the cabin. I went to bed early, lying under the thin blanket with my jacket still on. The bed creaked beneath my weight. Outside, the rain kept falling. I closed my eyes and listened to it, trying to ignore the way the wind seemed to carry faint sounds, whispers almost. Just the trees, I told myself. Just the wind through the graves. Eventually, I slept. I woke up to silence. The rain had stopped. No wind, just dead, heavy silence. I turned onto my side, staring at the dark room. My breath felt too loud in my own ears. Something felt wrong. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the wooden table, the walls, the door. Everything was the same as before. Then I noticed the footprints.
Wet, muddy footprints.
Leading from the door. They weren't mine. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The prints were clear, fresh. A single set coming in from the door, but not going back out. I gripped the flashlight tighter, scanning the cabin. There was nowhere to hide. The place was too small. I was alone. I stood up, moving toward the door. The lock was still in place. No sign of forced entry. I checked my boots. They were still by the door, dry. These weren't mine. I followed the footprints with my light. They stopped near the foot of my bed. Someone had been inside. I checked every inch of the cabin. Under the bed, behind the wood stove, even outside on the porch. Nothing. No one. The graveyard was silent. The trees unmoving. I went back inside and shut the door, double-checking the lock. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came slow. Gray light filtered through the window. I spent most of the day outside, checking the area. The rain had washed away any tracks beyond the porch, but I found something else. Something worse. Near the edge of the graveyard, right where the trees began, I saw a hole.
Agrave.
But it wasn't fresh. It had been dug up. The earth was piled to the sides, the casket inside cracked open. I didn't look inside. I didn't want to know. I went back to the cabin and packed my things. I didn't care about the money anymore. Before I left, I checked the door one last time. That's when I saw the marks. Scratches, deep, uneven, along the wood. Not from an animal. Too deliberate, too human. I left. I never found out who had been in the cabin with me that night, or who or what had climbed out of that grave. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that some things should be left buried. I had been working long hours for months, and I needed a break from everything, the noise, the people, the constant pressure. I wanted silence. I wanted to be somewhere far away, where no one could call me or knock on my door. My friend Luke owned a cabin in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods of Montana. He used it for hunting trips, but he told me I could borrow it for as long as I wanted. It was mid-October when I drove out there. The trip took nearly 6 hours, the last 2 on rough dirt roads that barely looked used. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon, and the air was cold. The sky was that deep, clear blue you only see in autumn, with the sun already dipping low. The cabin was simple, a small, one-room structure made of rough logs with a tin roof. There was a wood stove, a bed, a table, and a few shelves stocked with old canned food and hunting gear. No electricity, no running water, just a well out back and a bucket to draw from it. That was fine by me. I came here to be alone. I unpacked my truck, stacked some firewood inside, and lit the stove. The warmth spread slowly, the fire crackling as I settled in. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, their bare branches scratching against each other. It felt peaceful, exactly what I needed. That night, I fell asleep fast, exhausted from the long drive. The only sounds were the wind outside and the occasional creak of the old wood shifting as the temperature dropped. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. Something had pulled me out of sleep. I held still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim red glow in the cabin. I could hear the wind outside, but nothing else. Then I heard it, a sound just outside the cabin. It was soft, like footsteps in the leaves. I held my breath, my heart pounding. Could have been an animal. This deep in the woods, that was the most logical thing to assume. But something about the sound felt deliberate, like someone trying to be quiet. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, shining it at the window. The glass was fogged from my breath, but I could make out the trees, their branches shifting in the wind. I didn't see anything. I stayed awake for a long time, listening. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, and they were undisturbed except for a few places where small animals had passed through. No clear footprints. I told myself I must have imagined it. I spent the day hiking around the woods, getting familiar with the area. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, the trees packed tight together. The only trails were old logging roads, mostly overgrown. There was a stream nearby, its water cold and clear. As the sun set, I made my way back to the cabin, feeling better. The fresh air had done me good, and I was starting to relax. I cooked a simple dinner on the stove, then sat on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. The forest was quiet, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. That night, I woke up again. This time, the sound was different. It wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing, slow, close, right outside the cabin wall. I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The fire had died down again, the room mostly dark. I reached for the flashlight with shaking hands and turned it on, shining it toward the door. Nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, barely moving. The breathing had stopped. The wind outside had died down, and the world was completely silent. I told myself it was my imagination. I had been alone for too long, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin again, looking for tracks. This time, I saw something. Near the side of the cabin, the leaves were disturbed, as if someone had been standing there. I crouched down, my stomach tightening. There were no clear footprints, just scuffed leaves, but it was enough. Something had been there. I told myself it was a deer, a bear maybe, but deep down I knew better. That night, I locked the door and made sure my hunting knife was within reach. I sat up in bed for hours, listening. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps outside, then a long, slow creak as the porch boards shifted under weight. Someone was standing outside my door. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife and stood up slowly. The fire had burned down to coals, casting long shadows across the cabin. I took a deep breath, then turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window. For a split second, I saw something move, a shape just beyond the glass. It was gone before I could focus on it, vanishing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things, threw them in the truck, and got ready to go. But before I left, I walked around the cabin one last time. On the porch, right by the door, was a single footprint. It was a boot print, a man's boot. I drove out of there as fast as I could, barely stopping until I hit the main road. I never went back. Luke sold the cabin the next year. He had never experienced anything strange there, but he told me the new owner only stayed a few nights before putting it up for sale again. I don't know who or what was out there in those woods, and I don't want to know. I hadn't seen my cousin Mark in years. Life got in the way, as it does, and though we grew up close, we drifted apart. He became a cop, stationed in a small town a few hours from where I lived. I worked construction, took jobs where I could, and never really settled down. But when he invited me up to his cabin for a weekend of hunting, I figured it would be a good chance to reconnect. The cabin was deep in the woods, about an hour outside the town he worked in. He said he used it to get away from everything: work, people, the stress of the job. It was a small, old wooden place, originally built by our grandfather, and Mark had fixed it up over the years. The area around it was quiet, nothing but trees, hills, and an old dirt road leading up to it. I arrived in the afternoon, driving up that long dirt road, my truck kicking up dust as I got closer. The place looked exactly like I remembered from when we were kids, though Mark had replaced some of the rotting wood and reinforced the porch. There was a shed out back, filled with tools and hunting gear, and an old fire pit a few yards away. Mark was waiting for me on the porch, dressed in his usual casual clothes, a beer in hand. He looked older than I remembered, a little worn out, but still the same guy. We didn't talk much, just nodded, shook hands, and I unloaded my gear. That evening, we sat by the fire, drinking and catching up. He told me about his work, how things had gotten worse in town, crime picking up in ways he never expected. Drugs, violence, people disappearing. I figured it was just small-town paranoia, the way cops see the worst in everything. But there was something in his voice that made me uneasy. The first night was quiet. We slept in the cabin, both of us exhausted from the drive and the drinks. But I woke up at some point in the night, not sure why. It was dead silent outside. No wind, no rustling leaves, just silence. I wasn't even sure what woke me, but something didn't feel right. I got up, checked the window, but saw nothing, just trees and darkness. I went back to bed, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, we got up early, had coffee, and headed out to hunt. The forest was dense, the kind of place where it was easy to get turned around if you weren't paying attention. We walked for a few hours, tracking deer, but the woods felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something wasn't right. Mark felt it too. He kept glancing around, his hand resting near the rifle slung over his shoulder. I finally asked him what was wrong, but he just shook his head and muttered something about the woods being different than he remembered. We found tracks, but they didn't seem right. They looked like deer, but off. The spacing was weird, like whatever made them was limping or dragging something. Mark crouched down, staring at them for a long time before saying we should head back. That night, we sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the woods. It was better than the silence from the night before, but there was still something unsettling about it. Mark was quieter than usual, drinking more, looking toward the trees every few minutes. Around midnight, we heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just beyond the tree line. Not an animal, something heavier. Mark stood up, grabbed his rifle, and stared into the dark. I followed his lead, my heart pounding. We waited, listening. Then the footsteps stopped. The woods went silent again. Mark muttered something under his breath and told me to get inside. Neither of us slept that night. We sat inside, rifles close, waiting for anything to happen. Morning came and Mark decided we should check the area. We walked the tree line, looking for tracks, signs of anything. And we found them. Footprints. Human ones. Barefoot. Deep in the mud. Circling the cabin. Mark swore under his breath. He looked around, scanning the woods like he expected someone to jump out. "We should go," I said, but he shook his head. Not yet. He wasn't scared. He was angry. We followed the tracks deeper into the woods, keeping our rifles ready. They led us to an old, abandoned hunting shack, barely standing, its wood rotting, the roof caving in. Mark pushed the door open, and the smell hit us first. Something rotten, something wrong. Inside, there were old blankets, empty food cans, and a pile of bones in the corner. Animal bones, mostly, but there were other things too. Clothing, a shoe. Mark clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around his rifle. "We need to go back." We got out of there fast, heading straight for the cabin. Mark was tense, his whole body rigid. When we got back, he told me to pack up. We left within the hour, driving back to town in silence. Before we parted ways, Mark told me he'd be reporting it, but something in his voice told me he didn't think it would do much good. A few days later, I got a call. Mark told me they found someone in the woods, a man, living out there, surviving off stolen supplies, hunting whatever he could. They found more bones in that shack. Some weren't animal. They arrested him, but Mark didn't sound relieved. He sounded tired, like he knew it wasn't over. I never went back to that cabin. Mark sold it a month later. Whatever had been out there, whatever had been watching us, it wasn't just some random drifter. It had been there a long time, and Mark knew it wasn't the only one. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to sink behind the thick tree line. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a few days away from the city, just me and the stillness of the woods. I had rented the place online, an old, single-story log cabin deep in the forest of northern Montana. The listing had mentioned its remoteness, the nearest town being nearly an hour away. That had been part of the appeal. No noise, no distractions, just quiet. The drive up had been long, the roads winding and uneven, cutting through dense pine and birch. I had stopped for gas at the last town, stocked up on some food, filled a cooler with ice. I didn't plan on leaving the cabin much once I arrived. The place itself was simple, a small porch with a rocking chair, a stone chimney running up one side. The inside was rustic, the walls dark with age, the floors creaking under every step. There was a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bedroom in the back, and a bathroom with a dim light bulb that flickered when I switched it on. I put my things away, made sure everything was in order. The air smelled of damp wood and old dust. There were no neighbors nearby, no cell service. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through them. By nightfall, the cabin was swallowed in darkness. I had brought a battery-powered lantern and a flashlight, but I kept the fireplace going for the warmth. The isolation started to settle in then, the reality of being completely alone. Every noise outside was suddenly amplified, branches snapping, leaves rustling. Normal forest sounds, I told myself. Animals moving through the brush. I went to bed early, listening to the wind push against the wooden walls. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up, staring into the darkness, feeling like something was off. Not wrong exactly, but different. A shift in the atmosphere, like the woods outside were watching. I finally dozed off sometime after midnight. When I woke again, it was because of a noise outside. A distinct, deliberate sound. Footsteps on gravel. I sat up, heart pounding. The cabin had a small dirt driveway, but I hadn't heard any vehicles approach. I grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, aimed it toward the window. The glass was too dirty to see much, just the vague outline of trees and the faint reflection of my own face. The footsteps had stopped. I stayed still, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. Nothing. After a long moment, I got up, slowly, moving toward the front door. I didn't open it, just stood there, listening. I could feel the weight of silence pressing against me. Then, another sound. This time, not footsteps, but something else. A slow, dragging noise, just beyond the porch. Something was out there. I backed away, turned off the flashlight. I didn't want to be seen from the outside. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A deer? Maybe a bear? But bears didn't make dragging noises like that. I stood there for what felt like forever, barely breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound, every creak of the wood, sent my nerves into overdrive. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the area. The ground was disturbed, but not in a way I could immediately understand. The dirt had been pushed aside in a strange, uneven pattern, like something had been dragged, but not in a straight line. I circled the cabin, looking for any signs of an animal or something else. I found nothing, just the disturbed dirt and the lingering sense of unease. The day passed slowly. I tried to shake off the night before, telling myself I had imagined most of it, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But as evening approached, that feeling of being watched returned. It was subtle at first, just an itch at the back of my mind, but as the light faded, it grew stronger. I kept the fire going, kept the lantern on. I stayed inside, listening. And then, sometime past midnight, the noise came again. The dragging, closer this time, right outside the window. I forced myself to look. My heart was hammering, but when I shined the flashlight out the glass, there was nothing. I was done. I packed my things quickly, stuffing my bag with whatever I could grab. I didn't care about the food, the supplies. I just wanted to be out of there. I threw everything into my truck, turned the key in the ignition, and drove. Fast. The road was pitch black, the headlights cutting through the trees. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the town. The next morning, I called the owner, told him there was something wrong with the place. I didn't explain, just said I was leaving early. He didn't ask any questions, just said, "All right," like he knew. I don't know what was out there. Maybe nothing, maybe something, but I do know one thing. I won't ever go back to that cabin, and I won't ever go that deep into the woods alone again. I had been driving through France for the better part of a week, taking back roads and stopping in small towns, enjoying the quiet of the countryside. I wasn't in a rush to be anywhere. I just wanted to be away from everything for a while. The kind of trip where you don't plan too much, just take the road as it comes. It had been years since I'd allowed myself a break like this, and I figured I owed it to myself. Most nights, I found cheap motels or small inns to stay in, but on the fourth night, I decided to push further into a rural area. The sun had started dipping below the horizon, and I was already far from any real town. I pulled out my phone to look for nearby lodging, but the signal was weak. After driving for another 20 minutes, I finally saw a sign pointing toward a small bed and breakfast style cabin up in the hills. It wasn't listed on my map, but at this point, I just wanted a place to sleep. I followed the winding dirt road leading to the cabin. The trees grew denser the further I drove, their branches reaching over the path like they wanted to swallow it whole. The sky was a deep blue by the time I saw the cabin. It was a modest structure, wooden, weathered, and set slightly back from the road. A warm light glowed through one of the windows, a sign that someone was inside. I parked my car off to the side and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. A sign near the front porch confirmed that this was indeed a bed and breakfast. I knocked on the door and waited. After a few moments, an older woman answered. She looked to be in her late 60s, with tired eyes and a reserved expression. She let me in without much fuss and showed me to a small room upstairs. It was simple, just a bed, a small desk, and a single window that overlooked the dark forest. She told me breakfast was at 7 in the morning and that I was the only guest for the night. I nodded, thanked her, and locked the door behind me. The cabin creaked with the wind outside, but it wasn't unsettling. If anything, it was peaceful. I set my bag down, washed up in the small attached bathroom, and climbed into bed. The mattress was firm, the sheets clean. Within minutes, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me up. I was suddenly wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was silent except for the occasional groan of the wooden walls. I turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around me. That's when I noticed something, movement outside my window. It was subtle, just a flicker of motion in the darkness. I sat up slowly, my heart starting to pound. The window faced the tree line, where the forest began only a few meters from the cabin. I squinted into the night, trying to see what had caught my attention. Then I saw him. A man stood just beyond the trees, half hidden by the shadows. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. His posture was unnatural, rigid, like he was holding himself too still. I could barely make out any features, but something about him set off every alarm in my mind. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. I didn't move either. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. Another step. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling in the dark. No signal. The man took another step, moving into a patch of moonlight. I could see him more clearly now. His clothes were tattered, his face obscured by the angle of his head. But it was his posture that unsettled me the most. He was hunched slightly, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, as if he was a puppet with cut strings. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and moved toward the door. My instinct told me not to turn on the light, not to draw attention to myself. I checked the lock. It was secure. I stood there, listening, my ear pressed against the wood. Silence. I glanced back at the window. The man was gone. A new kind of fear settled into my bones. I stayed where I was, my mind racing. Maybe he had just been passing through, someone lost in the woods. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Then the floorboards creaked downstairs. I nearly stopped breathing. I strained to hear. Another creak. It wasn't the natural groan of an old building shifting. It was slow, deliberate. Someone was inside. I backed away from the door, my heart slamming against my ribs. My mind was already jumping ahead, trying to figure out what to do. The window. No, I was on the second floor, and even if I could make the jump, I'd land right where I had seen him standing. Another creak. I pressed myself against the far wall, my eyes darting around the room. There was nothing I could use as a weapon, nothing to barricade the door with. Then the footsteps stopped, right outside my room. I could hear breathing, not deep, normal breaths, shallow, uneven. I felt my stomach twist. The doorknob rattled. I sucked in a breath, my entire body going rigid. The lock held. Then, after what felt like hours, the footsteps moved away. Slow, measured. I waited, barely blinking, listening as they descended the stairs. A door opened somewhere below, the hinges whining in protest. Then silence. I stayed in that corner of the room until the first light of morning crept through the window. When I finally got the courage to move, I unlocked the door carefully, peering out into the hallway. Everything looked the same. No sign that anyone had been there. I crept downstairs. The front door was closed but unlocked. The woman who ran the place was nowhere to be found. Her bedroom door was ajar, the bed neatly made, as if it hadn't been slept in. I didn't stay for breakfast. I grabbed my bag and walked out to my car. The forest was quiet, the morning air crisp. I scanned the tree line one last time. Nothing. I got in, turned the key, and drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. I found a cafe, sat down, and tried to make sense of what had happened. I still don't have an explanation. I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or how he got inside. I just know I won't be taking back roads through France again. It was the last winter I spent in that cabin, and I think about it more often than I'd like to admit. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quiet getaway, a break from everything before spring came and I got caught up in the rush of life again. That was the plan, at least. I had been coming to the cabin for years. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place tucked deep into the woods of northern Montana. It had been in my family for a while, passed down through a couple of generations, and I used it whenever I needed to get away. There was no electricity, no running water, just a fireplace, an old propane stove, and a hand pump outside for water. In the warmer months, it was perfect for fishing and hiking, but in the winter, it was pure isolation. That's exactly what I wanted that year. Just a few weeks of solitude, away from the noise of the world. The drive out there had been rough. Heavy snow had come early that season, making the roads difficult. I had to park my truck nearly a mile from the cabin and haul my supplies in on foot. It wasn't the first time I'd done it, but the weight of everything, food, extra firewood, propane, made the walk slow and miserable. By the time I got inside, my fingers were stiff from the cold, my back aching from the strain of dragging the sled I had loaded with my supplies. The first few days were uneventful. The snow kept falling, burying the world outside in deep silence. I spent most of my time chopping wood, melting snow for water, and reading through an old book I had brought along. Nights were long, stretching on for hours in the darkness, but I was used to it. I had been doing this for years, after all. The quiet didn't bother me, at least not at first. It started with small things. On the fourth night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't. The noise was slow and deliberate, the crunch of footsteps moving through the deep snow. I sat up, my breath visible in the cold air. I reached for the flashlight by my bed and clicked it on, but by the time I got up and looked out the window, there was nothing there. Just the trees, their branches heavy with snow, and the pale glow of moonlight stretching shadows across the ground. The next morning, I found tracks in the snow. They weren't mine. They led from the treeline, stopping a few feet from the front porch before turning back the way they came. They were deep, pressed hard into the snow, but the edges had softened overnight, making it impossible to tell how fresh they were. I stared at them for a long time, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The nearest cabin was miles away, and I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. Maybe it was a hunter passing through, I told myself. Someone who got turned around in the storm. But that didn't explain why they had stopped so close to the cabin. That night, I made sure the door was locked before I went to bed. The next few days, I kept an eye out, but nothing else happened. The snow kept falling, piling up against the sides of the cabin. The tracks disappeared beneath it, and I told myself I had imagined the whole thing. It was easy to do out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Then, on the seventh night, I woke up again. This time, it was different. I hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anything, but something had pulled me from sleep, an uneasy feeling curling in my stomach. The room was dark. The fire in the wood stove burned down to embers, casting faint orange light along the walls. I lay there, listening, my breath slow and shallow. Then I smelled it. Smoke, not from my stove. It was faint at first, but growing stronger. The acrid scent of burning would mixed with something else. Something off. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. When I clicked it on, I saw it immediately. The door was open, just a crack, barely enough to notice, but enough for the freezing air to slip inside. I hadn't left it open. I pulled the covers off and moved toward it, every nerve in my body on edge. I swung the door wide, shining the light outside. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the ground untouched except for a fresh set of tracks leading from the porch to the treeline. I stepped outside, my boots sinking into the snow, and swung the light around. That's when I saw it. Not 20 feet from the cabin, a small fire burned low in the snow. It hadn't been there earlier. It was nothing more than a pile of half-burned sticks, but the smoke still rose from it, curling into the night air. Next to it, something lay in the snow. A rabbit. It was skinned, its body cut open, the insides dark against the white snow. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at it, my breath coming fast and sharp. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. I turned and went back inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed what little I could onto the sled, strapping everything down as quickly as possible. The fire outside had burned down to nothing, the rabbit gone, but I didn't want to think about where it had gone. The walk back to my truck was slow, every sound in the woods making my skin crawl. When I finally reached it, I tossed my gear into the back and climbed in, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine struggled for a moment before roaring to life. I didn't waste any time. As I pulled onto the road, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Someone was standing at the edge of the trees. I couldn't see their face, couldn't make out any details in the dim morning light, but they were there, watching. I didn't stop. I never went back.